but largely not going to be the absolute end all when you talk about the underlying data. Okay, so one of the first things, and this is kind of interesting for me because, as many of you are aware, in 2018, Visa officially replaced the term chargeback with the term dispute in all of their guidelines. And despite this change, the majority of merchants, and including us, continue to use the legacy term when describing payment disputes. We had the results are that the majority of merchants are actually using both equally, with a minority that have switched primarily to disputes, and still a good percentage that are using chargebacks. David, you're actually, you're on the phone. You're actually getting to interact with these merchants on a day-to-day basis. Is this consistent with what you find? Is chargebacks still sort of the term of preference?
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, I get the pleasure of speaking to merchants daily about disputes, and typically they still refer to them as chargebacks, just because humans are creatures of habits, and I think we're kind of just stuck. And that is the problem with disputes, is a chargeback as the result. So yeah, I still hear it quite often be referred to as chargebacks.
Yeah, I think that one of the problems, I mean, just between you and me, one of the problems is that we got in the habit of saying dispute chargebacks, right? So we have a bunch of language that we're in the process of going and cleaning up, because we were regularly referring to representments as disputes. And so now that the language changed, the biggest issue for us is that it's difficult to describe representments sort of colloquially, sort of just, so now we're trying to use terms like refute or respond to, or there's a few different ways that we kind of deal with that. Largely just our philosophy, and you guys can take this or you can leave this, but the way that we've sort of split the baby is when we talk about the actual mechanism. So we usually use the word term dispute to refer to the challenge of the transaction taken on the part of the cardholder or the cardholder's issuing bank. In contrast, we use the term chargeback to refer to the technical process by which the dispute is resolved. And another way you can kind of think about that is a dispute is always used as a verb, while chargeback is kind of the noun. And this is sort of the position that we've taken in this report, so as to be consistent with other things that we're putting out into the world. But it is an evolving situation, so it's going to be interesting, I think, over the next year or so to kind of see how all that shakes out. But for now, I think David, you and I are in agreement that chargeback and dispute are kind of the same thing, and it's just up to individual preference. This next one, and I'll just introduce the slide, but this is I think really telling, and part of the trend that we've seen for a long time. But the majority of merchants now say that friendly fraud is a concern, and I think that's new. David, you and I have been at this for a little while, and I know that when we started, friendly fraud was kind of, we had to sort of convince merchants or educate merchants on even that friendly fraud was an issue or that it was a large issue. But it seems like the majority of merchants consider it a major issue, and the overwhelming majority recognize it as some type of concern. And then conversely, a very small percentage seem to feel that they're taking appropriate steps to kind of deal with friendly fraud. Does this echo what you see in the market, and what insight do you have to offer to why this might be?
Yeah, I think this is pretty consistent with what I hear from merchants. Obviously, this is a merchant survey, so it should be true to what I hear each day. But I think the main, contributor to these stats would be we did have to make friendly fraud aware to the merchants, because it is often confusing to figure out, okay, what is fraud, what is friendly fraud, what is merchant error, what is criminal fraud. So first we had to uncover and unpack the chargeback source situation, and I think we spent the first 6 years of our career at Chargebacks911 just doing that, saying that, hey, a lot of these are not actual fraud, even though consumers are claiming so, and you're getting fraud reason codes. And now that merchants are aware of it, it is a very hard thing to approach. I mean, I think that's why the stat is so low on, merchants considering that they're, creating a situation to where they're fixing the issue, because friendly fraud is very hard. It can't be prevented on the front end with a fraud filter because it is a legitimate transaction. It's not stolen credit card details. So how do you manage that? But now, thankfully, there are a lot of tool solutions and things that you can do post-transaction to help, prevent some of that friendly fraud if you understand your situation and the source of the chargeback. So yeah, right along with what I see.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this slide is probably, of all the slides, this is probably the most telling of what the current state of chargebacks here now. Now the 29%. I mean, do you think does that seem consistent? Do you think that those 29% are really effectively managing friendly fraud, or what do you have a hypothesis there? Sometimes I wish we had better, follow-up questions, but the way that the survey was structured, I mean, is that merchants you think that are using third-party vendors, or is there a tendency for merchants to believe that they're mitigating friendly fraud better than they actually are?
Yeah, obviously, just because they don't understand the situation to begin with. But I think that's probably coming from merchants that are using some form of third-party assistance, whether that's just data aggregation, or it's intelligent data around chargebacks, or maybe they're using a tool like Order Insights to manage the post-transaction fraud situation. I think probably that stat is coming from they're using external help rather than just responding to chargebacks.
Great. Well, so this sort of, and this maybe, we didn't break down the previous slide. I think in the report we sort of discussed the implications of business size. But what we did with is we asked merchants if they were outsourcing some element of their chargeback management. When you factor for larger businesses, because smaller businesses, I think, rightfully so, a lot of times it's just not on their radar. But when businesses get to a certain size, I think that they have more skin in the game, so to speak, and they're more likely to turn to third parties to resolve at least some parts of their chargeback pain. So when we asked the larger business, around 43% of them said that they were already currently outsourcing some element of their chargeback management. I know, like, for me, that seems like that number has grown. I know, our business has grown, so I imagine that the size of the industry has grown. What is your take on that number? Is that about right, or what do you think?
Yeah, this was a little bit surprising for me to see that 43% were, outsourcing some element. But then I got to thinking about it, and chargeback management has turned into dispute management. So going back to the term change, we are facilitators for pretty much every dispute inquiry out there. So the terminology change, of course, came with V-roll, and Visa's changed to their structure and workflow. And with that, it's a dispute. It's not necessarily just immediately a chargeback. So there's all these tools and solutions available to manage disputes, which is what chargeback management has turned into. So this is not a stat, and this was such a broad question that it wouldn't be a stat to represent the merchants that are outsourcing chargebacks in response, like the representment process to a third party. I think this is more of a broad stroke to say, are you outsourcing, data integrity, or are you outsourcing and relying on third parties to give you insight to benchmarking and peer analysis? Are you outsourcing, some effort on the back end in the form of a tool like Order Insights or Consumer Clarity? Like, I don't think it's just, are you outsourcing chargeback disputes to someone? So as I started to think about the question, yeah, it seems on trend with what I would expect. I think a large majority of a large number of merchants have lately, especially with COVID, outsourced and relied on some help. Doesn't just have to be chargeback disputes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I appreciate you bringing that up. So one of the things that I'm always interested in is, because we hear a lot, And Bradley, maybe you can sort of join in, kind of give us your take on this. One of the things that seems consistent is that merchants feel like they're dealing with more net chargebacks than they ever have been.
Yeah.
It seems like a bigger problem than it was 3 years ago. And so what we tried to do is try to get a sense of, what merchants were viewing as being the contributing factors to that increase in chargebacks. Bradley, from your perspective, when you engage with merchants and when you guys are kind of, out in the industry, is that the sense that you get? Is the chargeback rate just on balance? I mean, is it an upward trajectory?
Yeah, I definitely think that there's been increased pressure, certainly in the pandemic year, but the root cause is just the increased move to online purchases by the market. And I think even 5 years ago, you weren't seeing the strong adoption that you're seeing today. And so we're definitely hearing from merchants that they want to accept more orders, but they're still not finding their footing with how to deal with that additional volume. And what we tell people is that 5 years ago, you would have talked about the holiday rush as being your big volume period. Now, the rest of the year has what used to be holiday volume period or more. And then you still have holiday volume periods because what the ability to purchase online is just mushroomed where more people are open to it. So the numbers are just going up exponentially every year.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's difficult to, I'm trying to think of an analogy, but it's sort of difficult to take an accurate measurement in a environment where sort of everything is expanding in every direction, right? So it's hard to get a real sense of, there's no constant variable, I guess is your point.
Yeah, but at the same time, we're definitely seeing just, even though that may sound paradoxical, I think it's true that everywhere is increasing and just the volumes are going up. The sophistication is another angle, which is going up. We're seeing increasingly sophisticated attacks. And so it's just a continual cat and mouse game for higher and higher stakes at higher and higher volumes.
Yeah. That's
Right.
I think that resonates. So this is the stat that we got, and it sort of seems like for the most part, merchants are split, or merchants sort of view criminal fraud and friendly fraud as both being things that that at least in their experience are becoming greater threats to their business. And to Bradley's point, that is due in part, I'm sure, to the evolving landscape where more and more transactions they're happening in the card not present environment. But David, I think maybe we could kind of move on to the next slide, because I know that we've talked about before, this sort of makes sense because I think most of the studies say something like around 50% of chargebacks have a fraud reason code. And we've talked a lot about, how, how that may be misleading, but it's very reasonable to think that merchants sort of view criminal fraud and friendly fraud as being sort of similar contributors to the increase in chargebacks that they're receiving year after year. But one of the things that we've tried to talk to merchants about, and I'd love it if you could kind of offer some insights here, because you're having these conversations with merchants where, some element of chargebacks, no matter what it is, if it's a 10% element or a 90% element of those chargebacks that are coming through with the criminal fraud reason codes, are actually instances of friendly fraud. And that tends to be one of the biggest challenges that merchants face. So could you talk a little bit about this and kind of make that real for everybody?
Yeah, so this is a result of, what Bradley was saying. It's just the growth and exposure to the chargeback workflow and process for consumers have grown to exponential volumes over the last few years. COVID forced more volumes online, whether you're comfortable making a purchase or not, just like my mother. She is from backwoods Tennessee, and she thinks everything is going to steal her identity. But, during that period, she couldn't go out. She has some health issues, but, it forced her to start making more purchases online, getting used to that process. And of course, through that, she got exposed to the chargeback process. She had to dispute a charge. So I think, with the volumes going up so quickly over the last 5 years, issuers are making it more easy for consumers to file chargebacks just out of being forced to handle the incoming inquiries. They have a cost to this process, just like merchants do. The acquirers have a cost to this volume increase. So the efficiencies to the process have been put in place, which removes friction, right? So when you call your consumer bank to dispute a charge, most likely the consumer will say that they have been, taken advantage of. Like, I didn't authorize this, or I never got the product, or, this is a fraudulent transaction, or, whatever the reason may be. But usually that request for a refund is coded as fraud because the issuer doesn't have information on the transaction like a merchant would to identify that maybe this is a case of just friendly fraud. We do put at Chargebacks911 all chargebacks in 3 buckets. One would be criminal intent fraud that makes up to 10% of what we see. One would be merchant error that could be 10 to 40% what we see. So it could be a very high number, especially post-COVID. Volumes, merchants having to deal with extra volume, maybe like fulfillment issues, things like that. A merchant error to where they didn't fulfill the order, they didn't get the product, could turn into a fraudulent transaction code related to a chargeback. So it could be merchant error, could be preventable, couldn't be, you accepted stolen credit card details. It's just a mistake. And then lastly, it's friendly fraud. So a lot of these do get mixed up in a fraud reason code. So merchants think that, going back to the previous slide, that true criminal fraud is rising just as fast as friendly fraud because they're unable to identify the actual source of that fraudulent reason code when dealing with chargebacks. So we could talk all day about this, but that's kind of how, friendly fraud gets mixed up in that fraud category when really it's just, a result of maybe merchant error or the issuer not having enough information or things like that.
Yeah, no, I really think one of the things that was really kind of made the light bulb turn on for me is to realize that a lot of times what happens is, somebody will contact their bank just because they want to know why something's on their credit card statement. But the bank in most cases is not in a position to provide that additional information. They're sort of flying blind, similarly to the way that the consumer is. So the only way that they can route that call is, to their fraud department in a lot of cases. So it's not, when you think about friendly fraud, I think it's super important that people sort of broaden the definition of friendly fraud to include a lot of stuff that's not, I mean, you're calling it fraud and it is fraud, but a lot of times it's accidental. It's not malicious.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why, new programs like Order Insights coming out, I think, the stat of merchants adopting, outsourcing some of these methods of chargeback management to third parties would be things like this, because like Amina said on the last, Amina with HelloFresh, on the last webinar we did on this, she said, hey, we dispute fraudulent transaction codes, and I want to be able to help the consumer. If you have been taken advantage of and your credit card got stolen, I want to be able to help you and accept that fraudulent reason code so that you get your money back. But I also know that a lot of these are coded as fraud. So it's hard for me as a merchant to actually help my consumers when you go straight to your bank. So the way around that, in a way to get that additional information on mistaken identity or I don't recognize this transaction, would be programs like Order Insights, to where that issuer could receive information instantly as the consumer's on the phone and say, hey, you don't remember this was for shoes you ordered and they were delivered on blah, blah, blah date. So it's interesting that merchants really, really want to help, but through getting mixed up with the friendly fraud mix, they're actually, disputing the wrong chargebacks, or maybe not disputing chargebacks that they should. And really, they just want to help the consumer, but it's super confusing.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. Okay, and sort of along this line, this is sort of David. I'm gonna at the end. I'm gonna have you talk about this because I know this is something that you talk a lot about your merchants, but something that we see, and so we sort of tried to ask the question. We wanted to know, of the merchants that were see, I can't say disputing chargebacks. I have to say refuting chargeback or representing chargebacks. The average win rate, the average reversal rate that they were claiming was 32%. And I think this seems consistent with other data that's been published. It was at least within the range of what I expected to see. But I think it's important, when you look at this 32% number, that you understand it in the context, in the larger context. So that we also asked merchants on average, what percent of the chargebacks did they represent, right? And that number was 43%, which if you go back to, just sort of that chart where earlier when I said around half of chargebacks are going to come with that fraud reason code, this 43% seems really reasonable, because merchants feel like, well, I'm only going to sort of represent, or I'm only going to worry about the bucket of chargebacks that's obviously instances of friendly fraud, or potential hybrid friendly fraud / merchant error type chargeback, sort of dissatisfied customers. And so 43% is a pretty aggressive strategy within that context. So then the 32% is really only of that 43%. And then once you figure out second chargebacks in that, and I know that there's some language issues around second chargebacks. I really don't want to get into that. There's been some changes with Visa and stuff. So I know that we report second chargebacks, and it can mean a bunch of different things. But actual pre-arbitration or arbitration, sort of escalations where the consumer files a chargeback again after the initial verdict by both the issuer and the acquirer was in favor of the merchant, was around 11%. So now you've got all of these three factors together, and this 32% that merchants are reporting is really around 12%. And something that we run into a lot, and David, this is where I'm real interested to hear kind of your war stories, is that what you've communicated to me is that when we talk to a merchant, they'll say that they have a 60% win rate, but then really when you get down to it and you get to this average net recovery rate, it's much lower than that. So can you talk a little bit about why it's important that merchants track not just their actual win rate, but the net recovery rate?
No, I don't want to talk about it. No, it's always a topic of discussion and back and forth, when a merchant comes to us to discuss win rates. So because we are a dispute resolution company, part of what we do is represent chargebacks. And of course, the end result and how successful we are depends on how much we're recovering for that service, right? So it's important when I walk through each merchant situation with them to understand their end goal. So, that might be a higher win rate, that might be lower chargeback rate, that might be, a lot of different things, but part of walking through their current situation so that we can understand what we're going into would be to understand, are you disputing? Okay, great. What is your current win rate? And this is always, surprising to them when they actually drill down to their net win rate. So, it's just like you said, if you get 100 chargebacks in and you only represent or respond to or refute 5% of them, 5 chargebacks, and you win all 5, you do not have a 100% win rate. So, it's kind of eye-opening, especially for the finance team, like a CFO, to understand, okay, where are the opportunities here? We always do a compliance review, a threat assessment to understand what you're collecting on the front end. We go through an assessment on each chargeback to understand the source of that chargeback, whether we can represent it, whether we shouldn't represent it. So by understanding just the source of your chargebacks, and this is probably the hardest things for merchants, by the way, to understand, okay, which fraudulent reason codes or unauthorized reason codes should I actually be responding to? And that is why that first initial 43% is showing up, because it's almost impossible in a timely manner to uncover which chargebacks to dispute when it comes to fraud and which ones not to. So that is a lower rate. So looking at this and trying to increase that initial dispute rate will help you get a higher win rate at the end. And win rate is always such a negative, conversation to have, just because the beliefs of merchants and the beliefs of, how we view things and getting into the weeds of things is very hard to walk, people through because it's actually at the end of the day pretty complex. But if you can identify your source of chargebacks, you can dispute more, and then you're able to recover. So, if you disputed, say, 86% of that, then you are going to, if your other rate stays just the same, you'll have more like a 24% win rate. So really, it's hard for merchants to understand to begin with what they should or should not dispute. But this is exactly what I see when I walk merchants through their numbers. Is they will start out thinking, okay, I got a 50% win rate, or I got a 60% win rate. And we'll talk about, well, how many do you dispute? What is your second or pre-arbitration rate? How many are you losing after you win them the first time? Looking at that holistically will also, open up some opportunities for them, even if they keep it internally. Yeah, hard topic to speak about, but online with what I see after we do some analysis.
Great. Okay. Okay. So now we're going to get into the pandemic. I think the name of this webinar is Pandemic. So, by the way, just hopefully, David, this will be the last sort of pandemic featured focused webinar that you and I have to do once we get through, the series of things that we do in support of this study. Because I think, this is just for me personally. I am ready. I know it's a new normal, but I am ready for things to get back to normal. And I know, at least in Florida, I can go to the grocery store and, I don't need to wear a mask. So hopefully this, whatever the situation is moving forward, in as much as our world has changed in the online environment, hopefully we'll reach some level of stasis, and we can begin to build our businesses and to expect things to remain fairly static. But the first question we asked is, what, if any, impact had COVID-19 had on your business? And this was interesting. And, and I think initially I was like, oh, of course it was mostly negative. But then I realized, the story that everyone's telling is that brick and mortar businesses got hammered, while online businesses sort of thrived. And we think about the example of, Amazon versus, like local malls and things like that. But David, you and I have been talking that it's really not that simple. The line between e-commerce and brick and mortar is often straddled by the same companies, and even online companies, had additional things to deal with. So can you talk about, from your perspective, what this result sort of means?
Jared, I'm having some problems with my computer, so I'm trying to get back on the screen and what slide we're speaking to.
Yeah. Okay. So as long as Bradley, can you see the slide?
Yeah, I still see the slide.
Okay. So I'll just explain it to you. You can hear me, David?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Okay. So basically the slide says that 41% of merchants said that due to COVID-19, their experience for their business has been mostly negative. 25% said mostly positive, or say 25% said positive and negative, and 34% said mostly negative. So basically the idea was a little bit opposite of what I expected, given that these were primarily merchants that, transacted online.
Yeah, I think that comes from a lot of different, we did do a broad stroke of merchants, small, big, large, in between digital, tangible goods. So I think this just boils down to, larger merchants are probably going to say that they experienced a, mix of positive and negative, just because they are, prepped to scale anyway. That is their primary focus. That's what they're, doing. They're scaling. So volume that came with COVID and the shift to online probably did not affect them quite as much as maybe a smaller merchant that has not built out a fulfillment process or a customer service process, or things like that. Good example of what I heard initially in the pandemic stages was an OTA came to us, an online travel agency came to us, and his call center was just inundated with calls. He was taking up to 15,000 calls per day when he was used to taking probably about 1,000. So I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was just crazy to think about that. So just because you have additional business and the shift to online and you're making more orders, you have to then think about, okay, now I have all this volume. So I think this stat comes from larger merchants are going to be more prepared to take that volume on and be more prepped to scale with that volume increase, whether that's extra fraud or extra orders or things like that, customer service. And then those smaller merchants are going to be kind of like side blinded from the extra volume. So this makes sense to me.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And the other thing that's important to remember, we did this study earlier this year. Most of the responses were in the February or March area. And so by then, the pool of businesses that consider themselves or that were transacting online was much larger. Maybe if we had done this study before the pandemic, the sample would have been primarily like online only type businesses. But really the barrier, the delineation between online and brick and mortar businesses is not what it used to be. There's it seems like every brick and mortar business has an online element now, directly as a result of COVID. There was a trend sort of going in that direction. So there's a certain subset of a lot of these businesses are probably have some element of brick and mortar and some element of online is what I'm trying to get at. The other thing that we asked them is the average increase in chargeback rates due to the pandemic, and the average, it was across all of the merchants, was 25%. Some merchants claimed a very little increase due to the pandemic. Other merchants claimed much higher numbers. Of course, I'm talking about merchants in the travel or some of the hospitality or entertainment industries. So that's another factor too. So merchants may, they as David said, may be receiving more orders, but there are consequences. There were direct consequences to the pandemic. We also want to know, how company size impacted how merchants experienced the pandemic, and at least in our survey, you can see that the results are pretty consistent. The larger the business was, the more likely they were to say that the pandemic had a net positive on their business. So I think that really goes back to David's earlier point about larger businesses sort of being in a position to take advantage of maybe less than ideal situation, but being able to survive it and sort of thrive in that environment more than small businesses who, fulfillment issues or sourcing issues were a problem. Keeping people in warehouses. There's all kinds of issues that smaller merchants wouldn't be in a position to easily solve. And then this one, we asked how much of a concern, if at all, is COVID-19 for your business in 2021? Now, keep in mind, this was in, let's just say March, but February or March of this year. So there was already some pretty good news. We'd already, sort of the vaccines were starting to work. I think for me, I was really surprised that, a majority of merchants said that 2021 COVID-19 was still going to be a concern, with almost half saying it was still going to be a major concern. So this sort of gave insight into the idea. I think maybe merchants are a little bit spooked, or is there something from your perspective, David, when you talk to merchants, is COVID still kind of at the front of their mind, or was this? Do you think if we did the study, if we asked this question today, it would be sort of a different answer?
I think it would be about the same, to be honest with you. I don't, and again, this is a broad question here.
Yeah.
If COVID is going to be a concern, the virus is still going to be around, then maybe that's not going to be. But like the effects are here, and it's just going back to my mom. She's found out it's very easy to order online, and she's going to start doing that, and that's her new thing. So the effects of COVID-19, I think, is what you're seeing as the concern here. The volume is pretty much here to stay because consumers have learned to behave in a different way. So adapting to that concern and what the effect of COVID is on the company would be what I think would be the major concern here. Just, ramping up certain parts of the business, responding to the additional fraud. Because again, now that consumers have learned to spend online, they're also exposed to the process of chargebacks. And it was interesting. I'm probably going to post this or share the article a little bit later on LinkedIn, but I was reading an article that broke down the percentages of why people are buying online and paying later more often now. And some of the stats that I was reading on that would be because it's not in my budget, or, I wanted to spread it out, or I didn't have to have a credit check, or I didn't, and things like that would be just a major red flag to me, because more consumers are purchasing things that they can't afford, especially with the rising volumes in COVID and struggling through that process and losing jobs and things like that. Merchants are going to be exposed to riskier transactions, even though it is the consumer making the purchase, and it's not a criminal out there just using someone's credit card details. So I think this has changed the landscape of payments altogether, and it's going to stick. And I think that's the actual concern, and not just the virus itself. Is we have new behavioral stats to deal with.
Bradley, I've got a couple more slides, and these are pretty similar in topic. Does anybody have any questions? Bradley, we'll just keep moving, but if anybody submits any questions, just let us know, because I'd rather sort of answer those questions if there's going to be any than take the time with these slides and risk running real close to the top of the hour.
Sure. We had a question from Jimmy who asked, what does companies greater than 70 million annual revenue mean? Only companies of this side were polled for this question. And I think he asked this at one of the earlier slides, but if you want to talk a little bit more about the sample size for the report, that would be helpful.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I appreciate that. And that was really, so what I encourage you to do is definitely go check out the entire study. When I was building this deck, what I was trying to do is I was just trying to put together sort of the surprising stats. And so for that question in particular, because of the bias of smaller companies being sort of less proactive in general with chargeback management, the interesting stat for me was the larger businesses, which tend to be more proactive in using third parties to address their chargebacks. And so that's why we pulled that number there. I believe in the study, in the actual published study, I'm not sure, but my recollection is that we have a more nuanced breakdown, and we talk about how company size sort of impacts that stat. But just for this study, that stat was pulled specifically because at least with that metric, it's larger companies are more likely to answer that way.
Okay, we also have a question from Lauren. She asks, how can you fight a dispute when CIBs are allowing 6 to 12 months instead of 30 to 90 days for a guest to dispute a charge? UPS tracking is only valid for 120 days. With the increase in UPS postal complaints, packages, i.e. packages being lost, showing as delivered but not being there, etc., that's pretty much leaving the merchant responsible for something because they can't fight.
David? This sounds like a you question.
So I'm reading the question again because that was a lot to hear.
Sorry, I know I talk fast.
No, it's fine. I think she's talking about the dispute period on a transaction. It depends on what industry you're in and what you're actually talking to. Some chargeback guidelines and regulations have changed lately to address just specifically the pandemic and get some merchants relief. But when disputing chargebacks, it's a combination of a lot of different factors that goes into representments and being able to dispute chargebacks. But when you're looking at chargebacks, it's not just about, say the tracking information that is valid for, 120 days. It's not just about, the fulfillment or delivery information in that representment. It's also about what type of transaction was this? So was it, in this case, tangible? Okay, that has a whole set of information that that issuer is looking for. And the information that should be submitted is based on, again, a lot of different factors. So, you're looking at the card scheme. So is this a Visa transaction? Is it Amex? Is it Discover, MasterCard? We're also looking at, okay, well, who's the issuer that filed the chargeback? What is their team looking for here? This is all stuff that we, of course, learned from disputing millions of transactions or responding to millions of chargebacks. And just learning this stuff. And then you also have to look at the reason code, because that's going to require certain information as well. So maybe the tracking information is even though it's only valid for 120 days and they have up to 12 months, maybe that's not the most important information to focus on there. I would probably do more research, because you'll find that you can probably still dispute that or respond to that chargeback with information outside of just the tracking information. It's horribly complex, but most of the times chargeback reversals boil down to just technicalities and policies rather than, having information and supplying it. I know a lot of merchants will look at a representment and say, okay, what information do I have on this? Now I'm going to submit this information. I'm going to give everything I have on it so that I have the best chance to, reverse this. And in reality, that's not actually what should happen or does happen. They submit that case to their acquirer. That acquirer has to pick it apart, label stuff. They have to redact information. They, have to look at the policies and be experts on that. And then a lot of times they're only submitting information that they know is going to reverse the chargeback and or reject your case based on the information that you submit. So the acceptance rate at your acquirer and what they submit to the issuer is very different than what you put in that case. So just because you don't have the tracking information, you probably can still dispute that quite successfully if you just responded based on all those criteria we talked about.
Yeah, I think merchants tend to have an over reliance on delivery confirmation, but and David, correct me if I'm wrong. In the Visa guidelines, the just a delivery confirmation is insufficient unless there's a signature anyway. So really, you want to be putting additional information in your cases, regardless. Just a delivery confirmation oftentimes is not enough unless it's accompanied by a signature, because there's no proof that they actually received the package. And that, that's just sort of, so then you get into the other things, and we generally try not to give advice because it is a complicated thing, but you get into things like where that's, if you have record of communication with that merchant or that consumer, then that's when those types of things are going to be real helpful to you. So, but I'm all right. What time is it? All right, so let's go. We'll do the next slide here, and then let's see. How would you characterize your expectations for your business in 2021 compared to 2020? And really, this I'm kind of hitting the same note here, I think. But this is this year. This is 2021 compared to 2020. I think the idea for me personally, and maybe this is just me being thinking about it through my lens. I just feel like 2021. Everybody should just be more optimistic compared to 2020. I mean, I personally had a difficult time in 2020. I imagine a lot of people did, some much worse than me, I'm sure. So in 2021, for people to say, compared to 2020, are you optimistic or pessimistic? I was just really surprised that, a slight majority were pessimistic about 2021. It was just surprising. I don't know, David, does this sort of jive with what you would expect, or were you as surprised by this?
No, I actually am surprised that it's not higher in the pessimistic category, just because when merchants call me, they're concerned. So they're understanding what they can do in 2021 to not experience 2020 again, right? So and it's just unknown. So we still don't know what's going to happen. Are we going to have a third wave? Are we going to, we just don't know. So I think that's where this stat's coming from. And I'm surprised, like, because this hit hard for a lot of merchants, and they, barely hung on. And, with the fraud rates going up so high, so quickly, it was very scary. And for the merchants that did survive through that, 2021 is just as scary. So I think it's created a deep scar, and I'm surprised the stat's not a little bit higher, to be honest with you.
I want to jump in here for a second, guys, because this combined with some other things, I took a couple notes while you were talking. You mentioned about the pandemic, and it's such an abrupt change. And I think that really ties into what you're seeing with the chargeback win rates. From our end as a publication, when we talk to merchants, one of the things that we always stress to them is that you have to understand what you're measuring. And a lot of times chargebacks are extremely emotional. They feel like theft in a way that other forms of fraud do not. And so when people measure them, they want to be able to say, we have a high win rate because it feels good. It feels like you're winning this battle. But the reality is that when you have something that's so disruptive to the entire ecosystem, like the pandemic has been, the sand is shifting underneath you. And so it shouldn't feel like a failure for you to reevaluate how you are calculating your metrics and really make sure that you're calculating the right thing, because we're all, as you said, in this pandemic suffering, and the old rules do not apply. And so you shouldn't personalize your fraud prevention efforts just looking for the best possible number. And I say this both to tactical fraud practitioners, but also managers and even C-level executives. There has to be some recognition that the rules of the games have changed. And what's important here is that we're all working together towards a single goal of a safer ecosystem for legitimate merchants to operate in. So when you're looking at your friendly fraud numbers, when you're looking at your chargeback win rate, especially those two, you need to be honest with yourself, not just about the numbers that you're getting based on your method of calculation, but also really ask yourself, am I calculating the right thing here? Am I looking at what I think that I'm looking at? Because at the end of the day, if you think your chargeback win rate is 45%, but it's actually 15%, then you're only doing harm to your business, and you're only doing harm to yourself because you're not being honest about where you can improve for the future. So we need to be careful to not let a fear of shame or a fear of underperformance in turbulent times keep us from striving to do better in the future with an honest assessment of what's going on in the present. And I think that really comes through with all the numbers that you're sharing here tonight or today.
Yeah, definitely. And I appreciate that insight. I think, yeah, I don't know. See, these pandemic webinars, they get real philosophical. But yeah, thank you, Bradley. I think I really take your point, and it is complicated, and merchants are struggling, and we've been, David, you've talked a lot about how it's been, you've always looked at it through the lens of human, but really in this last year, being able to offer solutions to merchants that were struggling has kind of meant a lot to you.
Yeah, it's a very human activity. So you have a consumer that is maybe upset, or maybe not the greatest person, or whatever the reason they went to their bank instead of calling you as a merchant, right? So that is a human. And then you have a human answering that phone that's going to be emotionally tied to that consumer because it's their customer. If they have a lack of information, they're probably going to make the wrong call. And then you have a team that's met with a charge that's coming through as a chargeback, and they know that it's a legitimate charge. So again, emotions play into this, and then they throw all of this information back at their acquiring solution and processing solution. Of course, they're like, why aren't you helping me? This is this is a legitimate transaction, when really they just have a part to play that transfers that information to them. And then it goes back to the issuer, and then you have a human looking at this case and making a decision. So friendly fraud is a very, very emotional process, and our machine learning does look into that emotion and human activity, and decides on what to structure that case and how to structure that case. But then it goes, back to, if you're disputing the wrong transactions, or if you're disputing the right transactions that come through as a chargeback, all that plays into your success rate. So talking about the buckets again, if you can look at and understand the source of your chargeback, say for instance, a merchant is actually getting a lot of fraud, they're not going to overturn those chargebacks. They're going to stick. They're going to just waste time. Or if a merchant is making some big mistakes, merchant error, it's going to be very hard to overturn those chargebacks. So, I think accepting, the actual situation for what it is, and accepting that you might have a lower win rate, and then uncovering and unpacking that situation would help you improve your situation, because it is, at the end of the day, going to allow your team to succeed if you get rid of merchant error and eliminate your criminal fraud in your win rate. You're going to get a better win rate, because then you're left with friendly fraud. So, but it is a delicate situation to walk into and have to accept, because, at the end of the day, these teams work extremely hard and they're experts in what they do, but, it's their job. It's their job on the line. So it's hard to accept that process a lot of times.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that's beautifully said. And I think it reminds me of, it's sort of not directly relevant, but it reminds me of why it's important that you keep in mind that the cases, when you compile a representment case, that case is ultimately going to end up at your customer is going to receive that if the chargeback is overturned. So, to make sure that the way that you're compiling it is matter of fact and accurate. It's one of the reasons why, we've, our automation is really reliant on, some manual processes to try to make sure that the representments that we compile on behalf of our customers are going to be accurate, and they're going to be respectful of the, whatever the situation is that led the customer to, file the chargeback. Because, if you anger the customer, it's not going to help our customer, right? It's not going to help the merchant. And, if you make a mistake, then that's likely going to motivate the ultimate cardholder to contact their bank and file that second chargeback. So, it is important that we don't strip the human out of any of this stuff. So I appreciate all your points there. So I think we're getting pretty close to the top of the hour, Bradley. What do you say? You want to call it?
Yeah. If anyone has any last questions that they want to send, give you a couple of seconds to send them in. If not, I want to thank everyone for coming and attending. Really insightful stuff here. Absolutely important to get as informed as you can about what's going on in these times, of course. And Jared and David, thank you so much for coming and sharing your insights with our audience. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Definitely check out the report. It's got some information in there. These are just some highlights. And as always, if you have questions, Chargebacks911 is here to answer questions, even if it's not doing business with you. We've been around the block a couple times, so we're happy to help.
Yeah.
Yep. And everyone will be getting a recording as well of the webinar, just so that they can check it out, and it'll have the report attached.
Yeah. And David and I are both active on LinkedIn. So if you have any additional questions or follow up or want some additional context, I'm sure that either of us would be happy to speak with you there.
All right. Well, thank you so much, guys. Thanks everyone for attending, and stay safe, and we'll see you again soon.